Hello and welcome to part 5 of this 6.3 kilometre Westminster Sightseeing Photorun, which goes around the Houses of Parliament and ends up at Lambeth Bridge. The first part takes us up close to the Palace of Westminster, Houses of Parliament, and then out towards Lambeth Bridge, and the second part basically shows it from a distance as we go along the Albert Embankment. There is a lot of information to talk about the Houses of Parliament, probably too much for this particular section, so I will create another podcast which will go into the building of it, why it's called the Palace of Westminster, the fire and the rebuilding in the 19th century. So look out for that one when it arrives. You'll also find there's two palaces in this final section. There's Westminster Palace, which was the King's Palace and later the government's, and then we have Lambeth Palace, which was for the Archbishop of Canterbury, his London residence. Now we get a bit of an idea about how this has changed over time when we look at the map from 1560. Now it's quite interesting to see from here that the two main structures that are still around are Westminster Hall and St Stephen's Chapel, and those two are in fact still integrated inside the Houses of Parliament as we see today, but at the time they would tend to be standalone buildings. When this map was put together, there'd recently been a fire at Westminster Palace and Henry VIII was moving all his court down to Whitehall Palace, which was down here. It was bigger and it suited him. He just needed to get rid of Cardinal Wolsey, which he managed to do, and then take over his property. But he was left with the question what to do with the buildings that he had vacated. So he gave those to the Parliament at the time. And this area suited him quite well. Notice there wasn't any bridge at this time. This is just in there to give you an idea about where the bridge would have been. But it was suitable for him because he could go off and do his hunting when he wanted to, or he could go off to the city or visit anyone he needed to from this particular position. It's quite easy to contrast this area on the left to the right where there's only Lambeth Palace. If we move on to this map of 1750, we can see that Westminster Bridge has just been laid out. The Westminster Abbey is very prominent. It's just had these two front areas built onto it, but the Palace of Westminster, or the Houses of Commons, is a scattering of buildings, but you can still see Westminster Hall quite prominent in this particular position. The layout of the Houses of Parliament, or Palace of Westminster at the time, could be described in English terms as higgledy-piggledy, and as we have a look at the maps here as it sort of like develops, you can see all the different buildings as they move off in time. And then when we look at the building in 1827, this is only about 8 years before a fire destroyed a large part of the Palace of Westminster, which was actually started because they needed to get rid of some tallow sticks, which was a form of ancient accounting, and they put them all into a fire in the Palace of Westminster, but it caused a chimney fire and then it destroyed a large number of buildings in that vicinity. What it didn't destroy was St Stephen's Chapel and Westminster Hall. So when they went to rebuild it, Charles Barry, who was the major architect at the time, incorporated that into the overall design. There are two main players in the rebuilding of the Houses of Parliament. One was Charles Barry, who was involved in the overall design and getting the space right so people could move around easily. And there was Augustus Pugin, who was very instrumental in terms of giving it the Gothic look. It'd also be quite interested to know, those people like Downton Abbey, that Charles Barry also did Highclere Castle. Now, one of the interesting things, if you just look at the 1869 map, is you can see that in order to build the palace they had to extend into the river, and this was quite revolutionary at the time, and in fact there was an awful lot of sophisticated building work that went on when they built Minster Abbey or the Houses of Parliament, including doing scaffolding on the inside because that was a more efficient way of building up the structure in a very confined space. We can see the overall design of the Houses of Parliament a bit clearer here, and where the clock tower would be positioned, and you can see how the outline of the Houses of Parliament was continued when they built the Victoria Embankment. An alternative view of the House of Parliament, it was built up in this time in 1845. You can see that there was no Lambeth Bridge at this particular point, and this was because the only way to cross the river here was via a horse ferry. But we'll discuss more about that later. And here we have a picture taken in 1889 showing the Houses of Parliament in all its glory, very much as we see it today. We can see that only part of Victoria Gardens is in place, so this part towards the west will be developed at a later date. We can see Parliament Square, quite a bit different to what we see it today because it doesn't have this line in the middle. And there was a number of developments around this area to the bottom left, which included aquariums and a hospital. On the other side of the river we can see elements of the St Thomas's Hospital. And over here we've got Lambeth Palace. So let's see what this run would look like if we were running it at speed. There's a couple of start points. You can either start on the bridge or just after the bridge at the train station entrance that is opposite the Elizabeth Tower. And that's where we're going to start this run from. When it's convenient, I'd take the opportunity to cross the road, but you could go to the very end and then cross the road then, depending on the traffic situation. So we start at the station, and if we can cross the road, we'll have the railings on our left hand side. When we get to the bottom, we're going to go into Parliament Square, which will then give us good views of the House of Parliament stroke Palace of Westminster. Then we have St Margaret's on our right hand side. Then we go next to St Westminster Hall, and then as we come out from there we've got Westminster Abbey and Henry V's Chapel on our right hand side. Then we've got Victoria Tower in front of us, and then we get on to College Green. Just on our right there was the Jewel Tower, and we're basically just going to cross the road at this point and then go into Victoria Tower Gardens past Emily Pankhurst. And then we've got the Burgess of Calais just on our left, another sculpture. Some good views that we can get if we go down to the riverside and see across to St Thomas's Hospital and Lambeth Palace. Then we can go back into the park itself, and then we've got the Buxton Memorial Fountain on our right hand side. And then we get to a small playground, and then we come up to Lambeth Bridge with Thames House in front of us, which will be where we'll finish this part of the run. So as you can see from this diagram, there is a number of things to see along the route. But before we do that, we'll just show you a few 360-degree pictures to help you navigate your way around this part of the photo run. Okay, for this start position is showing the Big Ben and the Portcullis House. We're basically going to be starting off with the entrance just where it says Bridge Street. That's the entrance where we're going to start from. We cross the road. This is going down the left hand side, but we could cross it beforehand. But we basically want to go across here to what is called Parliament Square, which is very easy to see because it's going to be the square in front of the Houses of Parliament. And then as you can see, we've got the main sort of views in front, government buildings over there. We've got St Margaret's and Westminster Abbey in front. As we get to this particular point, we've got St Stephen's Hall to one side, and we've got Henry VII's Chapel on our right hand side. And we then go through the gap into College Green, where we can see the Victoria Tower and the Henry Moore sculpture. And we're just going to cross over the road, basically where it's pointing to Victoria Tower Gardens, and you'll see there's a little entrance into the park. This is where Emily Pankhurst statue is, and then as we go into the park itself, take you right up to where the Buxton Memorial Fountain is. We've got some good views over towards St Thomas's on the other side and Lambeth Palace, but we just head right to the very end where there's Thames House and the Lambeth Bridge, and this is the view you see to finish this part of the route. So in terms of the things you see along the way, there is Westminster Station, which came here from 18 1868. It was originally called Westminster Bridge Station, and at the time it had a steam-operated district line. There have been a number of redevelopments during its lifetime. The latest was in 1999 when they built the Jubilee line, and this also has a link to Harry Potter in the Order of the Phoenix. You can see them coming out of the station, but the magical thing about that clip is that you see them coming down an escalator to go out, which is quite a difficult thing to do in a tube station. And here we have another view of Big Ben and the Elizabeth Tower. As I said, it first ticked on the 31st of May 1859, and the bell chimes in E. You'll see in the courtyard by Westminster Hall a picture of a man on horseback, and that is Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart. Like many kings up to the Georgian era, they often were involved in battles, and they often led battles in this country and abroad. So Richard I was king in 1189, so not long after William the Conqueror, and he was involved in a number of campaigns, his most famous being the Third Crusade, where he spent a lot of his reign abroad. He was also Duke of Normandy and Duke of Aquitaine and Duke of Gascony. He was Lord of Cyprus, Overlord of Brittany, Count Anjou, and he was also reported to have met up with Robin Hood. So he had quite a large portfolio of countries to visit. And this was not unusual in terms of the kingdoms in this part of history. Here we see him next to Westminster Hall, which was established in 1097, and this was by William II, or William Rufus, who came after William the Conqueror. And at the time it was the largest hall in Europe, with a hammerbeam roof, and it's been used for various activities, including the law courts, and one of its biggest trials was that of Charles I, who lost his head during the English Civil War. So here we have the back of Westminster Abbey. This is actually called the Henry VII Chapel, and that was around in 1517. So he's the first of the Tudor kings. We have Henry VIII coming after him, obviously. And he got his crown back from Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Fields, and that ended the end of the War of the Roses, which originally started when Richard II was usurped. Now the whole of this area is quite a hub of British history, so we've had a lot of coronations and funerals, and a lot of major events have happened in and around this area. So as we move towards the end of the Palace of Westminster, House of Commons, you can see the big tower here, and that's called Victoria Tower. Now this was, when it was built, the tallest building in Europe. And at the bottom is the Sovereign's entrance, so this is the entrance when we have the State Open of Parliament that the Queen would go into. What we're looking at in the foreground is College Green, where often you'll see television reporters reporting about events that are happening in Parliament. In front of that is a Henry Moore sculpture called Knife Edge Two Pieces, which is quite fitting for what may go on with inside politics. Now we cross over and go into Victoria Tower Gardens. Now, as you can see from the insert, only a portion of Victoria Gardens was developed in 1870. The rest would have come later. The sculpture you see in front of you is the Burgess of Calais, which is a Rodin sculpture, and that reflects an incident in 1347 as part of the 100 Years' War, where Edward I, thanks to his wife, able to save the Burghers from being executed after a siege that was taking place in Calais. Another piece of history we could see as we move further down the park with the Buxton Memorial Fountain, which is a memorial to the emancipation of slaves in 1836. Now this was originally in Parliament Square, but it got moved to this position after some redevelopments in that area. If you want to make a slight detour at this point, you can turn right and go to St John Smith's Square. Now this is a church that has been restored as a concert hall, but it actually dates back to 1728, and it's got a bit of a nickname called the Queen Anne's Footstool, because apparently at the time when the architect was asking her how she'd like this church in 1728, she kicked over her footstools and said something like that, which is why there are 4 turrets around it. So as we get to the end of the park, that's where we stop, just at the start of Lambeth Bridge, which is the end of this part of the tour.